Hello everyone, my name is Boulevard. This is Tournament Tactician, something that was once the premier tournament tier list for Legends of Runeterra on a weekly basis that is now something like, but not necessarily a tier list on the weekends of major events. It works, right? Things change over time. So, it's currently Wednesday. It's about 5:30 p.m. when I'm actually getting around to shooting this. I wanted to shoot it on Tuesday, but there's an important trend that's been happening over pretty much the entire year where, like, a lot of developments happened very quickly the week of the Open, and Nidalee was sitting at around like a 58% win rate last night, and now it's down to like 55, and I expect this to kind of continuously decline until we get to the Open where like almost nobody brings it, and I think that's important to recognize because if I had gotten up here and shot this last night, it'd be pretty wild for me to ignore Nidalee and not talk about it and be like, hey, yeah, this is like the big deck right now, nearly a 60% win rate. This should be very popular until, now that we're sort of seeing at least the start of the decline, we have a better idea that like this probably isn't going to last until the weekend. But here is the something like that is not necessarily the tier list. I don't think I can't set a custom number here. That is unfortunate because 200 is just a little bit too, well, actually 200's fine as long as we get to do this. So let's talk tournaments first. Over the last 3 days, since the Runeterra report event on Sunday, this is what we've had as far as like daily tournament winners. So, Runeterra report kicks off. Gnar J4 Warden wins, Jax Ornn, and Janna Nyla. Our top 8 for that event was 7 Gnar J4 Warden, which I want to highlight, I think is the most I've ever seen from a single deck. We've had champions that got 8 out of 8. We've had 2 champions do it. It was Gnar and it was Samira. And when Gnar did it, it was like 5 different decks. And when Samira did it, it was 2 different decks. It was Leona Samira and it was Samira Fizz. So, as far as a single deck, I think Gnar J4 Warden is the highest we've ever seen. Granted, this was not the biggest tournament we've ever seen. I think it was around 60 players. But still, I think that it was big enough that we can kind of call this one. We can say that that's the biggest representation of a single deck we've ever seen in a top 8 of a grassroots event. 5 Janna Nyla, 3 Heimer Jace, that's spelled with 2 Ys, because he's a really cool guy, and then just a bunch of 1-ofs. And I think this is actually pretty indicative of what the meta is going to look like. When we look over here to how I've sort of laid things out here, we've got meta definers, major players, flavors of aggro, and wildcard. Meta definers are the things that the meta is warping around. If you're looking to counterpick, these are the things that you want to look to counterpick. Major players are just decks that I expect to perform well. Flavors of aggro is really just to be like, hey, here are the aggro decks that are performing well. If you wanted to go a triple aggro lineup, this is where I would look. And Wildfire traditionally is like Annie Samira. And we've seen people start to splash Zed. I think you could just go Janna Samira, Annie Zed, and then Elusives. It is a little, I think Annie Zed is the highest win rate version, but it does get a little funky, right? Because like the Samira spell actually has a big impact in Wildfire in terms of activating flow. So maybe that's something you value. You can kind of figure that one out on your own. I'm not really here to talk you through like, yeah, if you want to do triple aggro, I would recommend, just based on stats, Janna Samira, Annie Zed, and Elusives. The Elusives being Teemo Yumi. Those are just like what people are allowed to play, right? And then for the wild card, Ambush is really the only like wild card deck we have. And as you can see, I humorously crossed through bait, but that's what these are sometimes. And sometimes they're not. Like at the last Eternal Open, Elise Gnar was in the wild card sort of section because when I had to shoot it early on in the week, that deck was just starting to rise up. It was like doing well in a couple of grassroots events or sort of like daily tournaments. The difference between a grassroots event and a daily event to me is like daily events are probably around 20 players cut to maybe a top 4. Grassroots events take place on weekends and are usually like 64 plus players cut to a top 8. So if my language gets a little confusing, that is the distinction. So for now, like Ambush has shown up in a daily tournament, but I'm not sure people are going to stick with this. I do expect the win rate to continue to decline. I don't think it's going to crack the top 5. But then we just look at everything else that is like top or one daily events in the last couple of days. We see like more Warden, more Janna Nyla, an Alawi deck. Don't really know what happened on this one. Just triple Shadow Isle apparently coming in and dominating whatever event that was. Again, it was probably only like a 20-person event, so I wouldn't read too much into it. Then triple Warden, and then again Gnar, Warden, Janna, Nyla, and Ambush. Something that's interesting is that you're not really seeing this as a lineup very often, the Janna, Nyla, Warden, Heimer, Jace. You're really not seeing that too often. And I don't think you're going to see a lot of 9x Warden either. I think 6x Warden is possible, But I think for the most part, people are just going to stick to the single Gnar J4 Warden deck. I don't think they're going to venture too far outside of that. The exception, of course, could be if they want to bring like Nico Warden. That's something I've seen a little bit on ladder. I don't expect that to be like a break. Like if you're looking for what I want you to bring as your 6x Warden piles, I don't know. I think Gnar J4 Warden is good. I think it's very good. I think it's very tight. I don't think you can really drop either of these champions. I think that J4 does so much in the mid-range matchups, like sort of the low interaction at fast speed matchups, like the Alawi X and the Aatrox matchups, because that Jarvan comes in and they don't really have a good way to pop barrier, right? They're Demacia piles. They're not going to single combat into your J4 to pop the barrier. That's such a losing line. In terms of like they're sacrificing the single combat, whatever the other unit was, and then probably the unit that's getting pulled by Jarvan still. So they're 3-for-1ing on your J4, which is a really good way to lose a mid-range mirror. And that's kind of what Warden is, right? Because Warden doesn't have to drop the Warden, and that's the beauty of the Gnar J4 version of the build. And you curve out pretty well. You don't need Warden to end the game. You've got other options. Glacial Saurian just does a lot of work, and obviously Glacial Saurion's like in every version of this deck, but the J4 in the champ slot, I think, really drives it home after the fact, where like you throw down that Glacial Saurian, then you go to combat with it, Jarvan comes in, and it's like, okay, whatever you had, whatever your big unit was that you were planning on either like mitigating damage with or trying to trade onto the Glacial Saurian, now pulled by the J4, completely out of the question. It's probably going to die there. Now something has to chump block the Glacial Saurian. Now all of a sudden my Jarvan's already 2/3 leveled because of the Glacial Saurian as well as the Jarvan. It's just a very strong combination of cards, and I don't think, like, I think you're going to run into very few 9x Wardens, but I think you are going to, obviously you see down here by player what I am expecting: Warden piles, then Janna Nyla, then Heimer Jace, then Alawi Jarvan, then Elusive. So a little bit of a hot take in there. We'll get to that. I think that you can't really target Heimer Jace. I don't think enough people are going to bring it. I think a lot of people recognize this as a very solid third deck, but third decks are the things that change most often between now and the weekend. The most popular deck rarely does. It's not unheard of, but it is pretty rare. And in this case, I think Warden is in such a strong position that it's just not happening. Then Janna Nyla, people are just going to default to. It's a very strong deck. It's pretty combo-y. There's, you know, when we look at the matchup charts, like, what is beating these things? Janna Nyla is losing to aggro and control, and that's part of where, like, Heimer Jace comes in as a good deck. It's why you see, like, Triple Shadow Isle doing well. Maybe there was a lot of Janna Nyla in the event that this player won. And what it's not doing well into is big mid-range. And what's funny to me is I climbed to Masters with Aatrox Bane, and when I would queue up into the Janna Nyla matchup, I remember going like, oh man, this is actually a pretty rough matchup. And I played against it 6 times on my climb to Masters, and I was like, okay, I think I've got this matchup figured out. Like, it's really rough. I'm probably close to 50-50. I went and I looked at the stats, and I was surprised to see Aatrox beating Janna Nyla. Then I went and looked at my own stats, and I was 5-1 against the deck. And I was like, oh, I guess my one loss was just so bad that I completely misremembered how this matchup went. But what I can say from experience is the way that I win this matchup most often as the Aatrox player has been with Zolani. I also now realize that I talked about this backwards. Janna Nyla is good into aggro and control and bad into big mid-range, which means this Triple Shadow Isle player, probably not a lot of Janna Nyla, probably a good amount of like Warden, because we see that Heimer Jace is like doing well into Warden. It's one of the few decks that is. And Elusives I have here in the top 5 because when we look at the things that are like doing good into the meta, Elusives pops up as good against Heimer Jace and good against Warden. And I think if people are just level 2ing it that hard, if they're just, because this is level 1, when you level 2, you go, what beats this? You look at this, you see Elusives, and then if you just stop your train of thinking there, yeah, maybe Elusives ends up being your third deck, this Teemo Yuumi deck that we're seeing, or maybe a different flavor of Elusives. I think that for the most part, these aren't like, Elusives aren't going to get handled particularly well no matter which version you're on, as long as, you know, you've got the burn and the champions and things of that nature. So yeah, I think like Elusives top 5, bit of a hot take. I just can't really think of a single deck that I think the top 3 is kind of locked. Heimer Jace might not be there, but I think like 1 and 2 are hard locked. Number 3 is soft locked. And then from there, no one really knows what to expect in terms of top 5. I've definitely had metas where like I'm big on Aatrox and then other people aren't big on Aatrox, and like I expect it to be top 5 and then it's just not. Like right now I wouldn't be surprised to see Aatrox in top 5, but I'm just not sure that that is where the community is at. So it's a little bit of a weird thing when you're trying to come through and do a sort of flowchart meta analysis like this, where it's like I feel like Aatrox should be top 5, but I don't think anyone else is going to. So if you wanted to get like Boulevard's real takes, I would expect Aatrox to come in, and then number 5 I'm still like up in the air. It might as well be Elusives, I guess. There's really no clear-cut 5th deck. For sure, no clear-cut 5th deck, especially when we're, like, compiling all the Warden piles together. So, again, Janna Nyla, good versus aggro and control, bad versus big mid-range. And that's the reason that I think like Jack Sorin is still a contender for not a top 5 spot. I think people are kind of moving away from Jack Sorin. I'm not sure if that's correct. Like I think Aatrox and Jack Sorin, very solid options, just big mid-range in general. Then we look at Warden, right? Let's keep on track a little bit here, going down what the stats say. Warden is beating everything except for Nidalee, Heimer Jace, and Elusives. And this is a big reason that like Heimer Jace is an appealing third deck to people. Even though most players are going to look to ban Warden, if your opponent is bringing double Warden, you would like Heimer Jace as a solid option into that Warden deck, because assumedly you are bringing your own Warden deck. So you're both banning, let's say, the Gnar version of Warden, and then you're taking Heimer Jace into their secondary Warden deck, and then whatever your third deck is, let's say it's Janna Nyla, yeah, you got to figure that one out on your own. But Warden just has really good stats across the board. It's the obvious number 1 deck for the format right now, in tournament especially. Janna Nyla, very obvious number 2. And then, again, number 3, a little bit up in the air. People, at the moment, midweek, defaulting to Heimer Jace. Could change by Saturday. Follow me on Twitter at BoulevardTCG, and I'll try to keep you updated on that. Just things that I notice. Then we just have, like, Aatrox, because the problem with listing Alawi in the major players is there's 3 Alawi decks. There's Alawi Swain, there's Alawi Jarvan, there's Alawi Volibear. And when we look at the stats for Alawi Volibear, they suck. They suck really big. And then we look at the stats for Alawi Swain, they also kind of really suck. Then we look at the stats for Alawi Jarvan, and they're not bad, but Jarvan's just so good in Warden. And I don't think you're going to really see people go like Gnar, Demacia Warden, and then Alawi J4 as another deck, but that is a possible lineup, right? Alawi does fall into this big mid-range category sort of blanket here that I have. And if you're wondering what I mean by big mid-range, it's kind of a weird blanket, because it encompasses in my mind things like Jack Sorin, Alawi J4, Aatrox, Warden, and then there are some exceptions, right? Like Janna Nyla, or rather, like Heimer Jace is beating most big mid-range decks, but then it's not beating Aatrox. It's actually losing to Aatrox. And this is sort of the problem with Heimer Jace, is that like it's not doing well into Janna, which you don't want to see. It is one of the only decks that's doing well into Warden, and that's what makes it such like an awkward thing, right? Where it's like, okay, well, my Heimer Jace might end up losing to the Janna Nyla, but it'll beat the Warden, and that's kind of where like the dogfights happen. This is like the XYZ lineup that I expect. Like this is what Majin Bey probably should bring. I think he's on some kind of copium right now, but Majin Bey, if you're watching, just bring this. Just bring this. Hey, baby. Just bring this. Get a little top cut action going. You can figure it out from there. But Majin Bey, hey, just bring this. Don't think too hard. You're the GOAT. Jack Sorin's definitely an option, though. Oh, Aatrox. So this looks a little weird. Aatrox is beating the meta, except Warden. It's beating Janna Nyla. It's beating Heimerdinger. It's beating all the Alawi decks. It is not beating Warden. So that is meta minus Warden. The only things that are really beating Aatrox, though, are Jack Sorin and Elusives. And I think that is what makes Aatrox a very solid number 4 deck in my mind. And again, like, Aatrox should be a top 5 deck. I'm not convinced it's going to be, but I very much think it should be. And then down here, I just want to... Let's talk about Lurk. Lurk beats 2 decks. It beats Volibear decks, which nobody is running, because if you're going to be in Freljord, you should probably just be on Warden. And it's beating Aatrox. And again, not too sure too many people are bringing Aatrox. And then it loses to every meta deck. Don't bring Lurk. This is not Lurk's time. Oh, you look at the ladder stats. Oh, Lurk looks so good. Lurk's looked so good for years if you look at the ladder stats. Then you go to the tournament and you realize Lurk's never won a tournament before, and you realize that's probably not changing now, and everybody that's bringing Lurk to the top 64 just has no interest in winning the tournament and collecting the maximum number of Runeterra points, and I'm going to stand by that until Lurk does win one of these opens, and then all the Lurk players come for me, and I go, oh, so you finally got one, and suddenly you think you're the hot shot, and then we're just going to have to argue about that, and then I'll say, Lurk wins one tournament, now everyone's getting baited. I'll just flip the narrative. It's fine. I'll continue to dunk on Lurk forever, because when it comes to a tournament setting, it's just a little bit too straightforward. It's a little bit too out of your control. Do you have attack tokens on odds? Question 1. We're at the mulligan stage. You've already determined whether or not you're winning this game or significantly advantaged in this game, just the way that it plays out. Just don't bring Lurk. That's about it. That's just how the metas are now. I can't really get into the depth of it, the nitty gritty, because this is not Wednesday evening. This is what it looks like. This is what the meta looks like. This is all the information that's out there. Saturday, some things are going to change, and I don't know what's going to change, but I need you to have time to access this information, so I can't really go hard on it and then have you watch this on Friday night and be like, oh yeah, I got it all figured out, and you're actually just like 3 days behind. So just to recap, this is the meta. This deck's really good, and I'm worried people aren't going to play it. This deck's like okay. The problem is like there's no great version of Alawi. The best version of Alawi seems to be the J4 one, and like I really just think that J4 Warden is like so strong that you should just like keep all of that together. Unless you're going double Warden, then you can maybe switch it up a little bit. But I think like taking the J4 out of Warden to run Alawi is it's a fine strategy. You could absolutely do that. I'm not going to dunk on you for doing that. I think it's like fine, but I don't think it's super optimal. And you can win a tournament not being super optimal. That's fine. You can physically do that. These are the aggro decks you can run. They're not looking great in the meta. Heimer just doing a little bit too well. Warden just like stays on board and has some units it doesn't really care about. It's pretty okay at stalling. Like Wildfire helps against the late game decks, but like Warden can absolutely kill you before you really get the Wildfires going. Heimer, Jace probably can't, or they're going to struggle with it a little bit more, but you know, they can still like draw too many scrap traptions, or like Heimer just comes out into like formula into something else, and it's just too many units for you to deal with before like the Wildfire kills them, or like they get off a Piercing Darkness and you still don't have an answer for that. Like Wildfire's got a few too many screws loose at the moment. I'd really like to see this tightened up before I can ever really give it a seal of approval and a recommendation. Elusive's stats say they're good, but I'm not convinced. I'm worried that the deck is a little bit too feast or famine. We'll probably see it in Top Cut. Well, sorry, we'll definitely see it in Top Cut, but whether it's 5 people or 15 people, I really can't say. It's stats-wise, it's looking pretty okay to make a top 5 appearance, but that's mostly because like I could not tell you what the number 5 deck is going to be. I think this should be top 4. Not sure if it is, but that's what it should be. And then number 5 is wild. And then Ambush. Ambush looks good. Ambush will probably not look good by Saturday. I do not recommend it. Again, I think it's a little bit too straightforward, a little bit too cheesy, and I think that like it just is going to have a lot of issues with like decks that run Vengeance. You kind of got like it's close. It's close. Like, I don't think I'm going to look at Ambush in anyone's lineup and be like, oh, if you had come to me, I would have talked you out of that. I don't think that's where we're at with Ambush. I think it's okay. I think it's defensible. I think, like, you know, maybe some people aren't well equipped to play with it. I think in Top Cut, it's a little bit more dicey, but for the Swiss rounds, I think it's totally fine. But that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I have been Boulevard. This has been Tournament Tactician for the Fates Voyage. Follow me on Twitter at BoulevardTCG. And if you, well, normally, if you want to, like, if you go through the Swiss rounds and you want to DM me on Twitter and talk about your Top Cut lineup, that's usually totally fine. I'm cool with that. Done it for players before, done it for Runeterra Open winners before. This time around, though, I am streaming the APAC, EMEA, and Americas Runeterra Opens back to back to back. And I'm going to have Yang Zero with me for at least APAC and EMEA, and then hopefully he's in Top Cut for the Americas. But because of that, I really am not going to have time to, like, talk to you in Twitter DMs or, like, answer you before that. So, like, pop into the stream, and then we can talk about your lineup in between opens or, like, in between rounds or something. That's something we can do. It'll be a little bit more of a public manner. If you want to DM me, you still can, but whether or not you'll actually get my attention is questionable. So just keep that in mind. But you can follow me on Twitch at BoulevardTCG, and when the Runeterra Open for APAC goes live, I will go live, and then I'll probably stay live the entire time because in between rounds, I'll probably do deck list compilations. But yeah, just wanted to shout out that I will be doing that for the first time, actually, that I've been co-streaming Runeterra Open. So yeah, you can come in and flame me about the if I misled you or something like that. You know, we'll show up and have a good time.